and welcome to Brown Bag, a podcast series looking at the interconnections between media, social media in particular, democracy, politics, and technology from a global south perspective. My name is Sanjana Hattatua, and I am a special advisor at the ICT for Peace Foundation.
And then on the other end, we're also seeing a really booming industry of disinformation, really incentivized by monetization as well. I think platforms internally there's so many silos and too much frustration in what we're seeing working with some platforms is they are good people working hard to change things, and often their work gets undermined by other parts of the companies that have different objectives.
Hello and welcome to another conversation. I'm speaking today with somebody I've known for many years. It seems longer than I've actually known her. First met her in Myanmar and have continued to be very interested in her output and writing even from afar. Victoire is somebody who has lived experience in Myanmar, lived through and experienced what occurred last year, and has continued to engage with the country from the lens of, if I'm not misrepresenting you, social media and its interactions with society and politics. Victoire, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, and great to be with you.
Listen, I'm recording this on a day that has very sad news that I think we all woke up to around the world, where the junta has executed four, including a former member of parliament. And I guess that's a sad but necessary segue into the first question, which is that even for myself, coming from Sri Lanka, because my own country is in quite a bit of a mess at the moment, it's really hard to find the bandwidth to focus on what's happening and going on in Myanmar. We know that a year ago, it was very much top of the news, but so many things have happened that it's no longer front and center on even those who have been moved by and interested in what's going on. But that's not the case for you. You continue to be engaged necessarily in what's going on. So I suppose for those of us listening, what do you think has changed over 2022, Victoire, that we need to be mindful of?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think there's been a big shift in attention, and that we felt it quite a lot in terms of how much coverage Myanmar has been receiving. But the situation is still very bad, and we still continue to see, there's continued violence across the country, and there's at this point no real end in sight. And that's so we've seen. And perhaps, I mean, it's a difficult, as you mentioned, particularly the incident of the last couple of days have been particularly difficult. Maybe the big change of 2022, if anything, is that people are realizing that the revolution is not going to succeed in 6 months' time, and that we are in for a longer, for the longer run. And I think it's that, realization that's sort of waiting on people at the moment, is that it's, when you in February of 2021 what you had was mass protests across the country, and this sense and this feeling that this is it, we're going all in, we're going to get rid of the military, and I think that the whole situation is getting more entrenched, and it's getting more difficult. Obviously, you have civil servants having to cope with having been unpaid for a very long time. Those that went civil disobedience movement, that joined the civil disobedience movement, that now may be returning. And so that, and I think there's in the country a bit of a return to a sense of everyday life has to go on. The most challenging,
I think you hit the nail on the head, I think. And that's certainly the sense that I get. And I wanted to ask a question that I wanted to ask later on, but you may recall that I wanted or invited you to speak at a conference that the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies here at Otago University organized in March 2021. And of course, you couldn't, because that was when all hell broke loose. And the question I wanted to ask is, in that time, how have you negotiated being away from the country with what you did for so many years, around 6 years, and invested in and helped craft and create and worked with people on the ground, and, leaving under the traumatic circumstances that you did? I suppose now you have had some time to reflect and also recover from having to deal with the immediate effects of all of that. How has it been engaging with the country deeply and every day, but from afar?
Not easy. I think it was particularly the first few weeks and months were very difficult. I think I left just before the the 27th of March, which was really one of the massacres. And
in 2021, yeah,
in 2021,
yeah,
and watched what was unfolding from a distance, trying to do safeguarding and backing up of some of those evidence of crimes being committed in the country. So it was this bizarre situation. I think we had this bizarre and going from Myanmar into Thailand at the time meant you had to have a 2-week quarantine. So all of us that moved over had a 2-week really constrained period in a hotel room, not able to meet anyone, and really just kind of sitting with our computers, looking at what was unfolding back in Myanmar. So that was a strange transition phase, and certainly a difficult one. At the time as well, we were doing a lot of I was doing a lot of work backing up evidence that we were seeing, and so that was basically my day, was watching a lot of those videos and hoping that no one pops up that I actually personally know. But over time, I think it gets easier, and I think one of the I'm now based in Thailand, where a lot of the Myanmar exile community has come to. So it's been helpful to have that community around, and to be engaged with that community and connected to the crisis. I know that when I went back to France for holiday, for example, that was very difficult, because you could really feel how Myanmar had fallen off the news, and how this was no longer really, it just felt to people like something very far away that was none of their business. And I think that's what's most difficult. But being in surrounding countries where there's a significant exiled community has been certainly helpful.
So let's talk about kind of the issues that you've been involved in regarding social media, both around the country, but also, your writing is looking at systemic issues as well. I mean, I want to get to the Toda paper from 2020 that you wrote about Myanmar in a series that I also contributed to, but let's get to that later on. But, I suppose one way that many engaged with what was going on and wrong last year, till it was overtaken by news headlines this year, was Myanmar's engagement with social media, and Facebook in particular, with Rohingya and all of that. So it kind of like predated the junta's shenanigans in the country. Since what happened, we've also seen news stories around the use of social media. But I suppose that's exactly what they are, news stories. And I don't think one gets a sense of what actually is happening on the ground with regards to how people are using social media. You have your finger on the pulse. How has social media shaped the way people interact, see each other, communicate, resist get entrapped by, also the juntas using it. So help us think through some of the stuff that you've been seeing and dealing with.
Sure. I mean, one big thing I think that is we're sort of starting with is a lot of there's been a huge crackdown on the media, the traditional media, right? And so a lot of the print media stopped publishing. Some of them had stopped during the COVID period, but certainly we've seen sort of a big reduction in an increased reliance by the media on the digital space. The number of people that are getting their information from the internet has certainly grown quite significantly. We've seen the emergence as well of a lot of very localized news pages and news outlets that have come up to provide information about what's happening in the particular area. So that landscape has grown significantly, and I think people have come to increasingly rely on social media for information. Now, we've also seen, and it's been tricky because a lot of the policies that platforms like Facebook have started to enforce more significantly touch on graphic violence, incitement to violence, a lot of things that make a lot of sense in peacetime, but are quite complicated to navigate in conflict time. And I think that has also sort of led to made it more difficult to cover certain information. And so we've seen with that sort of a push as well towards alternative platforms. Telegram really emerged in the early days of the coup, both among the pro-revolutionaries, but it's also been increasingly used by the military and proxy to push out propaganda and engage in harassment campaigns. So we've seen sort of a diversification of the landscape in terms of what tools people use. And I think, and that came from both sort of, it really emerged from a need to also be more careful about what you share where. And I think Telegram really emerged as people were more wary about who they shared information with and being anonymous in their engagement. So that really kind of kicked in the early days of the protest. But also we've seen Facebook take down a lot of contents from both sides of the conflict, and so really that has pushed a move towards more and different platforms being used as well. We've also seen a really big push towards YouTube as we've seen more and more video content in the early days sort of really kick in, and then now that has sort of continued, and we have YouTube sort of coming up and as an increasingly problematic medium as well.
So that's really comprehensive. And I guess the question that arises as a consequence, also linked to what at the time that we are speaking, Sri Lanka is going through, is that you have this tension, right? I mean, the global West and the Western headlines would see social media as all bad or all good. There's this pendulum swing every few years, from unbridled optimism to absolute despondency that it's all evil and, you need to get out of Facebook and whatnot. And, I think that you and I would inhabit a slightly different and more problematic reality where activists rely on it as much as the junta in Myanmar and, of course, the Sri Lankan government would rely on it to target the activists. And it's that gray area, it's that simultaneous interplay of helping as well as harming activism that I think you have been most engaged with. Could you speak to that a little bit? I mean, you kind of touched on that, but has there been any greater understanding around the use of social media for activism and resistance as a consequence of what occurred last year?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been some interesting new ways to leverage social media. I think one of the things that I found most interesting over the last year, which is sort of less your intuitive thinking around using social media per se, but we've seen a activist and pro-revolutionary forces leverage social media monetization tools as a fundraising method, which has been really interesting to watch, and essentially pushing out content, encouraging people to click on that content,
right.
and to so this has been the challenge, right? Obviously the goal here is not to push out really clickbait content that is problematic and that violates copyright and that is disinformation, but really, like, how can you leverage the fact that within the revolution you have hundreds of influencers, comedians, singers, whatnot? Can you leverage that content as a way to generate ad revenue and channel that toward fundraising? So I thought that was one of the most interesting a sort of development in that space, and it's been particularly interesting because, of course, at the same time as this is happening, we're also facing very, very problematic issues with monetization and the lack of care and due diligence by platforms when it comes to monetization. It's been pretty reckless, and so we're seeing, on the one hand, sort of a creative use of monetization as a fundraising tactic, and then on the other end, we're also seeing a really booming industry of disinformation, really incentivized by monetization as well. Monetization has been a really interesting and a really interesting part of my work in the last year, particularly because we're trying to tackle this problem of disinformation. We also have to handle the fact that there's some legit content creator in the country that should be able to make money, and if those legit content creator want to donate that money as a fundraising, then that should be somewhat supported. And at the same time, when you tackle monetization, how do you make sure that this doesn't negatively impact the media space as well, which has become increasingly reliant on revenues that they're getting from platforms as well?
And your conversations with the companies, if you're having the conversations, I don't want to assume that you are, but if these are ongoing conversations or they are conversations that you've had, are they open to the complexity and the nuance that you just said is present?
They are, because they are, in the sense of, like, they're forced to be. I think what we've seen is perhaps on the monetization specifically, one of the first and it just sort of come back to your first question, but one of the first instance that really triggered us to look into the problem was in the very early days after the coup, and whilst the protests were unfolding, and we started having a crackdown on protests. There were a lot of live video content that were doing really, really high, that were having really high reach. And at the time, as well, I was trying to back up content. Live videos were seen as perfect evidence because we knew who had filmed it, or so we thought. But what we discovered actually was that a lot of the videos were actually not live videos, but they were repurposed video being live streamed, and that they were being live streamed out of Cambodia by people that actually had no knowledge of the context. And I was watching these videos, backing them up for accountability purposes to the UN mechanisms and whatnot, eventually land in the ICC. But what turned out was those videos were actually, they were real, but they had been taken off YouTube and then live streamed through video platforms and put back into the context. So I was desperately looking at it as a source of information about what was happening, but it was actually not true. And so we raised this issue as we uncovered this in March of 2021. We raised this issue with the platform, saying, look, guys, this is actually really problematic because, one, it's actually it could affect the evidentiary base that will go into the case later, but also we are watching these videos thinking this is actually happening right now, but it's not, and that really has a really negative impact on people. I mean, I was watching the videos as a way of keeping track of the situations to protect my friends, and then realizing that this is actually no longer true. So that was a huge issue which we raised, and platforms did take this somewhat seriously, and sort of approached this with a pretty simplistic solution, which was to say, well, we're no longer allowing monetization in Myanmar, which, as you can imagine, what happens then is the problematic actors are very good at evading enforcement and going around this. So they are continuing and doing very, very well and still making a lot of money. Meanwhile, that has had very negative implications for the media, the traditional media, which actually lost a very significant part of their revenues. And they are, in the middle of the crisis, they are doing incredible work. But they're continuing to put out content that's of particular value of the public, which is actually in need of credible information. But they're seeing a lot of their monetization abilities cut off because of this simplistic response by platform. So we're trying to navigate the space and engage platforms around how they can come up with slightly more nuanced responses to those challenges, and really learn from it, because this is something that obviously is happening in Myanmar, but is now no doubt also happening in Ukraine, Afghanistan.
Other places. Yeah, exactly right, actually. Yeah. You would think that they would be more open to it. Listen, let's talk about the elephant in the room, as it were, Meta or Facebook. I still keep calling them Facebook. If I recall, in March, there was an Associated Press report that, in collaboration with an entity called Global Watch, revealed that this Global Watch tried to run 8 ads, hugely problematic to Rohingya, with the same racist, problematic, violent framing. And the ads were approved. Of course, the ads didn't run, but the ads were approved. And that was what the story was about. It didn't run, but that it was approved by a platform which surely should, in 2022, you would think, had its act together about the one context that it has got a large number of headlines around. But it doesn't seem to be the case. What's your experience looking at Facebook's flailings and failings, and I suppose some intentionality in getting it right as well over the course of, say, the past one and a half years now?
I mean, as with a lot of those conversations, it has to be nuanced, right? I think the baseline we started with in 2017 was so poor that to progress over that is not difficult.
Yes.
And there has been progress, particularly in regards to engagement. There's been a lot more engagement, and that has been very very good. We've seen more work happen in the Myanmar context. We've seen some pretty groundbreaking moves taken, such as the Tatmadaw ban policy, which bans the Tatmadaw from using Facebook, which is a big shift in the way the platform approaches things. So there has been a number of developments that have been positive. Now, as you say, and this is where we kind of keep hitting at those systemic issues, a lot of the more fundamental problems still remain. And that's, as you say, Global Witness ran this experiment with ads, and they all went through, which is a fundamental issue. Similarly, what we're seeing is a lot of the players that are currently active on behalf of the military or as proxies of the military in pushing some of the current problematic narratives, the very same actors that were pushing anti-Rohingya content 10 years ago. I mean, many of them, we are by now talking to platforms, in particular Facebook. We're talking about them on a first name basis because we all know who people are. But they still manage to get back onto the platform time and time again. And so we have this huge issues around recidivists that the platform hasn't cracked. And so I think there has been positive developments, undeniably, in terms of we've seen some measures being taken to address the situation, but some of those more fundamental issues still remain, and it is highly problematic that 5 years on we still have the very same players continuously. We have people that have been designated under the DOI policy as dangerous hate individuals are still finding their way back onto the platform using their name, their photo, and are still actively engaged in a lot of this, a lot of the problematic content that we see. Those are some of the more fundamental issues, but we see we're struggling to see platforms basically take action on those, and that's a problem.
And I can empathize. As you know, Sri Lanka and Myanmar have a rather tragic parallel journey around all of this, both from the genesis of the platform abuse through to a lot of what you're talking about, including actually what I see now in Sri Lanka, right? I mean, you have DOI individuals and the equivalent of Mabata, getting back on the platform. And I think it's worse, right? I mean, until and unless an individual like yourself sometimes tells the platform, they themselves don't know, as surprising as that may sound to listeners in 2022. So, I mean, I had a hunch, Victoire, but it's really, what's the word I'm looking for? Sobering to hear from you that that's where we are still at. I did want to ask you, because again, this is one of those stories that came to our radar and then because of everything else that's happening, went off it. In 2020, I think it was in December 2021 that we first got to hear about Facebook being sued for $150 billion. What's happened to that case? Do you know anything in terms of progress? It certainly escaped my radar in terms of updates, but maybe you do know something.
As far as I know, there were two class action suits, and both of them are unfolding. I'm not sure where they are at exactly, but they are moving forward, and interestingly so. I think it's the first time that we may see a case of reparation make it through. So both cases are, as far as I know, are going. I don't know exactly where they are at. In parallel, there was also an OECD complaint that's also being pushed. Was in both cases sort of calls for reparation, and I think both cases would be very interesting to watch from that perspective.
Really interesting,
as far as I know, that's the first time that we may see a case for reparation.
I in the context of what happened in February with Ukraine and Russia's invasion, I think you were part of some Twitter conversations that I was part of, and with Brian and Brian from formerly Facebook, counterterrorism expert, and there were cut a long story short, there was the suggestion that the company's response to Ukraine was shaped by its experience of Myanmar, and some lessons learned that you, Victoire, had also contributed to. So I think you shouldn't underplay the role that you played in helping this company understand what to do and what not to do. If that holds to be true, and please correct us if we are wrong in that assessment, what do you think are the lessons that Facebook learned as a consequence of having to deal with Myanmar when they were forced to deal with Ukraine in February?
Look, I think one of the things we're realizing, and we kind of worked through the Rohingya crisis, an election, and then a coup. Right. So three very different types of crisis, but crisis nonetheless, is that they are actually patterns of what happens on platforms that come up in the midst of crisis. And that's, repurposing old content, pretending it's happening right now, a increased use of platforms for surveillance purposes. So we've seen sort of different things come up that are sort of bound to be problematic. And what we've seen is obviously in certain cases, Meta worked to come up with a mitigation measure. And those mitigation measures then proved to be quite handy as part of a toolkit for how do we respond to crisis elsewhere. Unfortunately, though, I think there's still a bunch of different issues that have emerged in those crises that aren't really properly, there isn't proper tooling around. And it would be really interesting to think about, can we tally what are some of those patterns of response or use of social media in the midst of crisis that perhaps we should spend more time thinking about addressing and what learning from that specifically. So I think in the context of Ukraine, we saw the rollout of locked profile, for example, which is something that had come out of needs that we faced in the context of Myanmar after the coup. Profiles being used as a main source of intelligence about people, and then as material for doxing individuals and calling for their arrest, right? Something that was a big deal and continues to be a very big deal. And so Meta worked on a locked profile tool that then proved quite handy in the context of Ukraine and in the context of Russia, sort of needing that capacity to lock profiles much quicker. So that was certainly something that I think they not only learned about the problem from Myanmar, but they actually, by investing in developing tooling in the context of Myanmar, they were way more prepared when it comes to the Ukraine crisis. But there are a lot more issues, I think, that could be unpacked when it comes to crisis and crisis use of social media, and a lot more work that could be put into trying to design solutions for these issues. Because ultimately, when you're addressing one of those problems in a context like Myanmar, what we've seen is that it becomes useful thereafter. And in the context of the log profile, it became widely useful in the context of Afghanistan and then the Ukraine crisis as well.
Before I want to go into the next one, I mean, part of my work here in New Zealand is dealing with what I've called Dantean hellscape, that's Telegram. It's really horrific in terms of the hate, hurt, and harms, absolute gore, violence, QAnon, every imaginable conspiracy. There's nothing really good that comes out of it. And I know that in Russia post-Ukraine, or after the invasion of Ukraine, the story is more nuanced. Even within Ukraine, the story is more nuanced as well around the use of Telegram. But I wanted to use what you said earlier as well, and ask you, to the extent that given the rise in the app's use over the past year and a half, are you aware of how it's being used? And we've talked about the doxing, which is obviously very problematic. Have activists embraced it more? Has the resistance movement embraced it? What do you see on it that maybe not on Facebook, etc.?
Well, look, in the early days, of the protest, people turned to Telegram, sort of learning from the Hong Kong protest movements, and as a way to sort of have a more anonymous engagement. And it picked up very quickly among activist communities and then the entire revolutionary movement. But what we've seen is, as it picked up and became more prominent, I think at this point in time, we probably have about 1 million users in Myanmar. Okay. So it's still sort of fairly limited, but it's picking up, right? And so as it was picking up, what we saw was obviously the military side setting up their own channels as well, and the structure and the way that Telegram as a product is designed makes it the ultimate tool for doxing campaigns. It allows you to crowdsource information and then really blast it out to a widespread audience. And so it's been used extensively for doxing campaigns in the last few months. And many of those doxing campaigns have resulted in the people being doxed getting arrested. And so we've seen hundreds of people getting arrested as a result of content shared on Telegram. So that's been sort of the main concern with the platform. And the platform itself is obviously not invested in Myanmar, not interested. There's no content moderation for Burmese. There's no Burmese content reviewers. There's no Burmese classifier.
There's nothing. I mean, on that, I think the whole world is on the same page. I mean, it's unclear what capacity Telegram has in any language, in any country. Leave aside Myanmar. Sure. It's actually horrific. It is absolutely horrific. But also, I think there's a question as to, like, the tool itself in the way that it is designed as a product. There's thinking that needs to go into this as well. It's the ultimate tool for doxing. I think that's... like what we've seen essentially is some of those military stakeholders. It's Gestapo on steroid, right? Right. And it really, like, so there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into both. How do we get Telegram to pay attention, and if they're not going to be moderating at the content level,
at least being aware of which actors are weaponizing the tool and moderating at an actor level.
Yeah.
But also what needs to happen to secure the tool.
Fair points. I want to kind of bookend, or rather end the conversation with something that you wrote for the Toda Peace Institute, and I'm looking at it here on my screen in June 2020, titled "The Role of Social Media in Fomenting Violence, Myanmar." And it's an excellent paper. I don't know whether you recall what you wrote in it. It seems a lifetime away, but in your recommendations section, you made a few recommendations to social media companies. You said prioritize human rights due diligence. You said engage directly with local civil society. You said contextual knowledge and policies around protected categories are very important. You wanted them to scale, regularly audit, and continuously improve country-level enforcement, scale efforts to detect and curtail abuse. But the one thing that I wanted to focus on was that last recommendation that you made, which is to preserve evidence of abuse, which at the time and continues to date to be something really interesting. And I think as a consequence of Ukraine would be even more of a challenge. On the one hand, you have, possible war crimes, right? And crimes against humanity and human rights violations and acts of terrorism that would contravene all the policies that you can imagine governing the platforms. On the other hand, I think the case you make is that it's really important to preserve these as records, right? With the metadata and whatever that was associated with the content intact, even if it is taken out of circulation. So, I mean, if you were to revisit that, Victoire, that recommendation, could you reflect on what it's been like a year or a year and a half since in that regard? This is not something that many people think about.
I think it's a tricky one because you have evidence, like content that is in itself evidence. So a video of a war crime, for example, and that might be somewhat possible for platforms to assess what constitutes potential evidence of war crime that they should be preserving. But what we're really talking about is the evidence of some of those campaigns that are being spread, and the content is slightly different, and it's not as obviously evidence of a crime, right?
Yeah.
And I think in the context of the Rohingya crisis, what has been frustrating is the content that has been preserved and is discussed about being preserved is content that is associated with a coordinated inauthentic behavior operation that has been attributed to the military. And so within the context of those takedowns, the content is retained and becomes available. But there's a lot more than what is being obviously caught and taken down under this. And a lot of content is taken down under standard policies, whether hate speech or disinformation and harm. And so the content that gets taken down under standard policies may not be retained at all. And I think one of the things we've seen with platforms is it's often obviously much faster and much easier if content violates one of the standard policies to take it down under that policy than to actually investigate a particular set of actors and look at a takedown as an operation, an information operation. But the content that gets taken down under standard policies does not get retained.
Right.
And so I think part of the thinking here is how do we look at what needs to be preserved more broadly than just a specific those specific sets. If we are going to be understanding what actually took place, what happened. I mean, this happened to us in the election times, for example. There was a clear campaign that was unfolding, but it was much faster for Meta to take down the content on a one-off basis under the policy.
Yeah.
And so there has not been retention by Meta of that content. And whilst we know that there was a coordinated campaign taking place that would benefit from being further investigated and eventually attributed for accountability purposes, this might never be possible because the content is now gone. So I think that there's that question of like, now that we're going beyond just evidence of war crimes being committed offline, shared online, but into the space of a information operation and campaign that span across multiple, potentially, days, weeks, months of content. How do we identify what constitutes an information operation and make sure that we retain that content? Is very it's complex for sure, and it's an area in which there needs to be a lot more thinking put in, because there's obviously privacy implications as well of retaining everything. There's cost implication of retaining everything, but we need to think about collectively need to think about what should trigger preservation requests and how to put boundaries to what needs to be retained. But it is important, and it has been it's been very, like, we've done some archivings ourselves, and I know you do a lot of archiving, and being able to look back at that content with the benefit of hindsight and newly acquired knowledge is really critical. So hopefully we'll see some more developments in the months to come.
Fingers crossed. As a last question, it does occur to me that you would be the ideal person to join Meta or Twitter or YouTube or Google or any one of these platforms. And I know that listeners can't see this, but you just made a face that was contorted, expressing your sheer disdain and disgust even at the mere suggestion of it. But, I suppose some listeners would think, you have these multi-billion, trillion-dollar companies that can't seem to get right what you have so clearly articulated in this podcast. So you do wonder why they can't, and whether individuals like yourself can't help get their act together. But it kind of is mixed with my last question, in that, insofar as what next, Victoire? I mean, for you, for the engagement, for the work that you're doing, for the country. I know that before we started, I lamented also, given what Sri Lanka is going through, that it'll be a while before we can go back, return to our home countries, or certainly for me to return to Myanmar, as much as I would like to do so. So, given that there's, as you first said, no easy end or early end to any of this, what next? What do you hope to do? And why did you make a face when I made that suggestion?
No, I made a face because I think I think platforms internally there's so many silos and too much frustration. And what we're seeing working with some platforms is they are good people working hard to change things, and often their work gets undermined by other parts of the companies that have different objectives. And I think that those friction will really get to me. And the frustration of it all. So I think that's perhaps why I wouldn't want to work within the companies, because I think you're faced with those frictions a lot. But what's next for us? I think we've made good progress over the last several years in terms of getting improvements when it comes to issues that are Myanmar specific. And getting improvement from Facebook in terms of expanding, contextual policies, improving engagement. There's been some good progress on issues that are very specific to Myanmar. What we struggle to get progress on is issues that are more systemic. And so what's next really is to further unpack those issues and work in collaboration with others that from a variety of countries to document and create an evidence base of how those issues are actually presenting themselves, the impact that they're having, what the root causes are, and looking at how we can collectively push for change. I think there are issues that we can push for change at a Myanmar level, and some of the systemic issues we really need to collaborate with others across the global majorities, in some cases the global north as well, to really make a case for why some of those issues need to be addressed and what their impact is. And so I think part of what we're looking at sort of into 2022, 2023 is how do we build on our understanding of those issues and work collaboratively with others across many other high-risk countries, but also the global majority more broadly, to build stronger cases and stronger coalitions so we can actually get movement and traction on some of those issues.
Fantastic, Victoire. Thanks again for joining me I know it's a busy time. It's always a busy time for you. And again, I mean, I want to be conscious about the fact that we are recording this on a day that we've both heard some very sad news, and one can only hope that things get better and quickly. And thank you for what you've done as well.
Thanks so much for having me.